50 years after the Fair Housing Act and MLKs d.eath, King's Dream lives on. Ben Carson. This April marks the 50th anniversary of two seminal moments in our nation's history, one tragic, the other triumphant. 50 years ago, Americans witnessed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the passage of the landmark Fair Housing Act. Each event is inexorably linked with the other. King marched on Washington for jobs and freedom. He marched from Selma to Montgomery for the right to vote. He wrote from a jail cell in Birmingham that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Recognizing that racial inequality was not limited to the nation's South, King made one of his greatest stands during the Chicago Freedom Movement, demanding an end to raw discrimination in the sale, rental and financing of housing. Set against the backdrop of deplorable living conditions in the country's northern cities, the push for fair housing challenged segregation and racial redlining that limited housing choice for families based upon the color of their skin. We're investing in what works to reduce school shootings and make schools safer. Marco Rubio. Ron Paul, bring troops home from Syria. Now Black Americans and other minorities of a certain age remember this time because they lived it. I lived it. We couldn't share in the American dream of homeownership because we didn't have access to mortgages, even federally insured mortgages. We were denied access to decent rental housing, concentrated into slums lacking decent schools and jobs. As a child growing up in Detroit during the struggle for civil rights, I saw the impact of discrimination firsthand and witnessed the impact these closed doors had for my family and our neighbors. I experienced it again after my parents separated and we were forced to live in a small apartment in Boston with my aunt. Year by year and march by march, despite threats and persecution, King led a nonviolent movement for equality that saw no room for hate. Tragically, an assassin's bullet ended his life, ignited our nation, and threatened to derail his powerful message of hope. When Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, he was less popular than Donald Trump is today policing the USA. A look at race, justice, media. But hope never dies, and 1 week later, on April 11, President Lyndon Johnson signed the landmark Fair Housing Act into law, prohibiting discrimination in the sale, rental and financing of housing based on race, color, religion, sex or national origin. The Fair Housing Act was amended in 1988 to expand these legal protections to persons living with disabilities and to families with children. 50 years later, I lead a department that keeps this promise alive by enforcing the Fair Housing Act and making certain the aspirations of law are made manifest. As our nation recalls these tragic and triumphant events, we also need to rededicate ourselves to battle injustice in our housing markets. We honor these two moments in our nation's history by continuing to confront overt and even subtle discrimination that persists half a century later. And we resolve to take King's Dream into the next 50 years. The dedicated men and women of the Department of Housing and Urban Development hold their duty and mission sacred, working every day to provide safe, fair and affordable housing to every family. There is still a lot of work to do to make good on the promise of the Fair Housing Act. Until housing discrimination is resigned to the history books, HUD will continue to fight for fair housing. It is central to our mission, and it's the keystone of our nation's creed that all persons are created equal. Ben Carson is Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development.